This video will give you a brief overview of the SQL Server stored procedure feature in SQL Server 2016. This lets you embed R code inside of your SQL stored procedures. You can easily integrate this feature into an existing RTVS project by right-clicking, selecting Add New Item, and you can see that SQL R stored procedure is one of the new options that you can choose. Click on Add, and you will see that it creates a new file called SQL sproc.r, which actually consists of 3 files. The first file is the file that contains the R code that you would like to embed inside of your SQL stored procedure. The second file is the SQL file that will contain the SQL that will generate the input data set that will be processed by your R code. And then finally, there is a third file, which is the template file, which combines the R code that you wrote in the first file with the SQL code that generates the input data set to your R code, combines them together, and describes the shape of what the return result set is going to look like when you execute it. So let me switch to an example that I've already created. In this example, we have a few chunks of code that I'm going to walk you through. The first chunk of code is the transformation code. What it does is it takes 2 different columns, the hack license column from the data frame, the medallion column from the data frame, and simply concatenates them together using the underscore separator character. The code up here at the top is the code that we will use to test the R code below by using the RTVS driver library, connecting using the current connection inside of your project, and passing a SQL query to SQL Server, which we're going to look at next. The SQL file is this simple query: select top 100 medallion and hack license columns from the NYC taxi under sample table. Let's go back to the stored procedure, and let's integrate in this query with our stored procedure. We can do this easily by dragging this file over here to where the quotation marks are, going to the end and deleting the quotation marks. When I dragged and dropped the file into the R code file, we wrote the code that is used to read the contents of that file into a string, which is then passed to the SQL query function. So let's next look at our settings file. Our settings file contains the database connection string that we're going to use to connect to the database. So let's see all of this stuff in action by running it. The first thing we'll do is we're going to execute the database connection. And let's drag this window over here so you can see it. And you can see that we defined the database connection string. Next, let's run the RTVS, load the RTVS library, connect to the database. And finally, once we have the connection, let's execute our query. You can see by using the variable explorer that we now have the results of our query. Medallion and hack license now show up. Now let's run the R code that we wrote that will concatenate the 2 columns together. And again, if we inspect our data table, you can now see there's this new key column that shows up there. And then finally, the last line of code, we won't bother executing that because that simply copies it to output data set, which is used by our stored procedure. So now we're satisfied that the R code and the SQL code does what we want. So what we will do now is let's go back and look at our template. And to remind you, the template combines the R code with the SQL code that we wrote in the second file, combines them together, and then describes the shape of the result set where I'm going to return medallion, hack license, and new key. Remember, new key was the column that I generated in the result data frame that contains the concatenated columns. I need to do one last thing before I can publish this to the database. I need to take our test code up here, because we're no longer going to need this code because the SQL stored procedure is going to provide us with input data set. So I'm just going to go comment out the code inside of my R file. Now that I've done all of this, I'm now ready to publish it to the database. I'll select Data, publish with options. Database is selected. I'm going to click on publish, and this will go off and publish the stored procedure to the database, combining together all of the files that we were looking at. Once that operation has completed, let's go bring up our SQL Server Object Explorer, and you can see that we have DBO stored procedure, which is the same name as our file here, has now been added to the database. If I right click and say execute procedure, we're going to go get a brand new window that is bound to our database, and we're going to go execute the query. We're going to see now medallion, hack license, and our generated key is all together. So in this video, what we've seen is a simple walkthrough of what you can do to combine your R code, your SQL code, to generate a new SQL stored procedure using the features inside of RTVS to make working with this inner loop of R and SQL more productive.